The low hum of the restaurant's chandelier trembled above me as I heard my son call me, the old man who pays. Still, I kept my hands folded, tracing the edge of my water glass to steady myself. As that soft hum deepened, it wrapped around the truth I'd ignored for years. While its vibration settled into my chest, I finally saw what my silence had cost me. The same quiet hum told me he didn't just disrespect me, he never truly knew me. That's when I decided, the next time that chandelier hums, it will echo over my justice, not my humiliation. Before the story begins, tell me, where are you watching from? I hope your day's gentle and calm. Please like, subscribe, and let's start our story together. The dinner was supposed to be simple, just a quiet meal between father and son in the familiar warmth of the restaurant Arthur had visited for years. Nestled in a calm pocket of Chicago's affluent North Side, the place was known for its soft golden lighting and the low murmur of conversations that hummed like background music to a life Arthur rarely felt part of anymore. He had chosen the corner table, the one he used to bring Tom to when Tom was a boy excited to order dessert before dinner. But tonight, Tom walked in late, wearing a scowl that looked permanent now, his phone in hand, thumbs flying as if Arthur had dragged him away from something far more important. Tom sat down heavily, tossing his napkin into his lap without looking up. "Let's make this quick, okay? I have somewhere to be after this." The words weren't said with hostility, they were worse. They were indifferent, the kind of tone that said Arthur's time didn't matter, the kind of tone Arthur had grown far too used to hearing. David, the waiter, approached with his usual polite smile. "Good evening, gentlemen. Can I start you with something to drink?" Before Arthur could answer, Tom waved a dismissive hand. "Yeah, just bring me the usual." And Tom jerked his chin at Arthur without even meeting his eyes. "He's just the old man who pays." The words hung in the air with a cold, cutting weight. David's smile faltered. A couple at the nearby table glanced over. Even the clinking of silverware from across the room seemed to pause. But Tom, oblivious to the sting of his own cruelty, was already back on his phone. Arthur felt the blow, not loud, not dramatic, but deep, like a bruise pressing from the inside. He didn't flinch, didn't look away. Decades of practice had taught him how to swallow pain without letting it show. His face remained calm, almost serene, but behind his eyes something old and tired trembled. It wasn't just the insult itself. It was the ease with which Tom said it, as though Arthur had never been anything but a wallet on legs. Arthur forced a small nod at David, signaling that everything was fine, though both men knew it was. As David stepped away, Arthur drew a quiet breath. He had given this boy everything, a childhood safe from the struggles Arthur had endured, an education he'd worked overtime to afford, countless second chances when Tom's temper or pride had burned bridges. And still, somehow, Arthur had become the villain of Tom's story. Or worse, he had become irrelevant. He looked around the restaurant, as if seeing it for the first time. The ornate wooden beams, the framed photographs of the early days, the piano in the corner playing a slow, nostalgic tune. He remembered bringing Sophie here when they were young and hopeful, before life splintered in too many directions. He remembered Tom as a child, gripping his hand with excitement as the servers passed by with dishes that smelled like home. This restaurant had been a place of warmth once. Now it felt like a theater where Arthur had been cast in a role he didn't recognize. The quiet, aging man tolerated out of obligation. As he lifted his water glass, a flicker of movement caught his eye. At a table near the back, a woman watched him with a steady, unreadable expression. Dark hair pulled back elegantly, posture straight, confidence radiating from her without effort. He didn't know her, yet something about the way she observed him, calm, almost knowing, felt strangely familiar. That was Clara Hale, the restaurant's owner. Though Arthur had seen her before in passing, he had never been the subject of her attention. Tonight, however, her gaze lingered like she understood something no one else did. Tom scoffed loudly at something on his phone, muttering under his breath. Arthur looked back at his son, noticing the sharpness in his features, the tightened jaw, the bitterness that seemed to age him far more than life should at 30. How had he become this man? How had Arthur let their relationship fall so far without ever stopping it? The question burned inside him. For a moment, a brief, dangerous moment, Arthur imagined speaking up, calling Tom out, demanding respect, telling him that words have weight and sons should not wield them like weapons against the people who rise. Ed them. But the thought evaporated as quickly as it formed. Years of swallowing conflict had carved deep habits into him. Every time he had the chance to push back, something froze him in place. The fear of losing Tom completely. The fear that one wrong word might send his son further away than he already was. Arthur lowered his gaze to the tablecloth, steadying his breathing as a knot tightened in his chest. He wasn't powerless, not really, but he felt powerless with Tom. And tonight, that feeling settled heavier than ever, as if the quiet contempt at this table might be the beginning of something far darker than Arthur was ready to face. Across the room, Clara continued to watch him, her expression shifting ever so slightly, as if she could see the storm forming just beneath his silence. And as Arthur finally lifted his eyes again, he felt, without knowing why, that this dinner was the beginning of a change he could no longer avoid. A change Tom wasn't prepared for. David approached their table again with a tray of drinks, but the warmth he usually carried was dimmed by what he'd witnessed earlier. As he set Tom's glass down, his eyes flicked briefly toward Arthur. Just a moment, barely a second. But in that small gesture there was something like sympathy. A quiet acknowledgement that he'd seen the disrespect, felt the temperature shift in the air, and understood more than he let on. David wasn't the type to interfere, yet the tension between father and son pressed against him like static. He lingered for a breath longer than usual, as if silently checking whether Arthur was truly all right, before stepping back into the slow rhythm of the restaurant. Arthur felt the weight of that glance. People didn't usually notice him, not in the way David had just done. It made the ache in his chest fold deeper into him. He sat with his hands clasped, his fingers tightening slightly every time Tom shot him another annoyed glance. The remark, "He's just the old man who pays," was still echoing inside him, rattling his composure with each replay. A part of him wanted to lean forward, demand that Tom see him as more than a walking checkbook. Another part hesitated, trapped in decades of conditioned silence. What if speaking up only pushed Tom further away? What if saying the wrong thing burned the last fragile thread between them? Tom didn't notice his father's turmoil. He was too busy typing aggressively on his phone, jaw clenched. When Maya finally answered his text, Tom's irritation spilled out in a low, heated whisper. "I swear he does this on purpose," Tom muttered, not caring whether Arthur heard. "Just sits there staring, never saying anything, never pushing me, never supporting me when it matters. He just exists." Arthur's eyebrows dipped ever so slightly. He wasn't sure which part hurt more, the accusation itself or the casual tone with which Tom delivered it, as if it were simply a universal truth. Tom kept going, growing more animated as Maya's replies fueled him. "He acts like being quiet is some kind of wisdom. It's not, it's weak. He never fought for anything. And now he wants to act like he understands my life, my struggles. He held me back more than he ever helped." Arthur looked down at the tablecloth and suddenly memories spilled in, uninvited and painfully vivid. He saw himself standing outside a school gymnasium years ago, waiting for a young Tom to finish basketball tryouts. Tom had stormed out, furious for not making the team, and Arthur had placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You'll find your place, son. This isn't a failure, it's a beginning." Tom had shrugged him off, shouting that Arthur didn't understand anything about him. Another memory came, Tom at 16, slamming the door after Arthur tried to talk to him about college applications. Arthur had stood there in the hallway, holding the unread brochure in his hand, hearing Tom's angry footsteps fade. There were good moments too, small, fleeting, but the painful ones crowded forward now, merging with the sting of tonight's contempt. Tom leaned back, scoffing loudly as he finally pocketed his phone. You know, Dad, sometimes I wonder if your silence is your way of pretending you're better than everyone. Like you think patience is some kind of virtue. All it does is make you look weak. And honestly, he shook his head, letting the unfinished sentence land harder than the words ever could. Arthur swallowed, a tightening sensation climbing his throat. Something inside him, a dormant, tired place shifted. Tom's words weren't new, but the cruelty behind them felt sharper tonight. Maybe because Arthur recognized something he'd never admitted before. He had allowed this to happen. He had allowed years of quiet endurance to be mistaken for weakness. He had let his love, his sacrifices, his steady presence become invisible. Across the room, Clara Hale watched again, not with pity, not with curiosity, with a kind of measured awareness as though she were studying edges of a picture she had seen once before and was suddenly recognizing anew. Her expression didn't change, but there was something intentional in the way her eyes lingered on Arthur, something that suggested she knew more than she revealed. Arthur felt Clara's gaze even before he fully turned toward her table. Their eyes met for a passing moment, and he felt the faintest stir in his chest. Not comfort, not hope, something else, something he couldn't name yet. Tom exhaled sharply, drumming his fingers on the table. Are you even listening, Dad? Arthur lifted his eyes, the quiet inside him shifting, rearranging itself. He wasn't sure if he would speak tonight. He wasn't sure if he could. But something had begun to move beneath the silence, something long buried and no longer willing to stay hidden. Tom waited, growing increasingly impatient. And Arthur, for the first time in a long while, felt the first stirrings of a storm forming inside him. The apartment was quiet when Arthur returned home, the kind of silence that didn't soothe but echoed. He set his keys down on the small oak table by the door, listening to the faint clink as if that sound alone could anchor him. But the sting of Tom's words, sharp, careless, humiliating, followed him inside like an unwelcome shadow. He's just the old man who pays. The line replayed with painful precision, tightening something in his chest that felt older than he wanted to admit. He sank into the worn armchair near the window, where the city lights shimmered like distant promises he once believed in. His whole life had been built around sacrifice, providing, working, staying steady even when life tilted. But tonight, he wondered whether any of it had mattered. Was he really just a background character in his own son's life? Had all those years spent trying to shield Tom from hardship only created resentment instead of gratitude? He rubbed a hand across his face, the weariness settling deep. He wanted to believe he'd done his best, yet Tom's contempt made him question everything. The ache burrowed in, familiar yet sharper than before, pressing him toward a truth he had spent years avoiding. Maybe he had been living in silence so long that he no longer knew how to break it. A soft rustle interrupted his thoughts. An envelope lay on the kitchen counter where he'd tossed the day's mail earlier. He hadn't noticed the handwriting until now, elegant, unmistakable. Sophie's. His breath caught slightly. He hadn't heard from his ex-wife in months. He opened the letter carefully, unfolding the paper as though it might tear beneath the weight of what she had written. Arthur, I've noticed changes in Tom, dangerous ones. His anger has grown and he refuses to take responsibility for anything. I'm worried. He blames you for everything, and I don't know how much longer I can stand by and watch him ruin himself. He needs guidance, even if he won't admit it. He needs you. Please talk to him before he crosses a line he can't undo. Sophie. Arthur stood still, staring at the words that felt like both a plea and an accusation. Sophie had always seen the emotional shifts in Tom long before he did. Her concern wasn't surprising, but hearing it laid out so plainly sharpened the ache inside him. She was asking him to step in again, to be the anchor Tom needed, something Arthur wasn't sure he still had the strength to be. Before he could even process the letter, his phone buzzed on the table. Tom's name flashed across the screen. Arthur hesitated but answered, Tom. Tom didn't bother with greetings. His voice was already heated. "I've been thinking about earlier. You know, maybe the reason I'm not where I should be is because of you." Arthur closed his eyes. "Tom, that's not fair." "No, listen. You never pushed me. You never challenged me. You kept me small with your quiet, your passiveness." Tom's frustration poured through the line like steam escaping a pipe. "You act like you sacrificed everything, but all it did was hold me back." The words hit like blows, relentless, unfiltered. Arthur opened his mouth, then stopped. Something inside him shifted, not anger exactly, but a kind of awakening. For years he had taken Tom's criticisms, absorbed them, believed that enduring them was part of being a good father. But now, hearing Tom twist his sacrifices into failures, something stirred that he couldn't push down anymore. "Tom," he said quietly, steadying his voice, "you can't keep blaming me for every decision you've made." Tom scoffed. "Spare me the lecture." The call disconnected before Arthur could respond. He stared at the silent phone, feeling the pressure of everything unsaid building inside him. For the first time in years, the idea of standing up to Tom didn't feel like a threat. It felt necessary. A soft vibration against the wooden counter drew his attention. An email notification. "Clara Hale." Arthur frowned as he opened the message. Clara's tone was formal, yet there was something personal now woven through her words. "Mr. Green, I saw you tonight. I believe there are things about the restaurant and your past that deserve to be acknowledged. If you have time, I would appreciate the chance to speak with you privately. Clara Hale." Arthur read the message twice, unsure what to make of it. What past? What role? Clara had spoken as if he were part of something bigger than he remembered, as if she knew a version of his history he had somehow forgotten or buried. Her words lingered, deserved to be acknowledged. He stood at the window again, watching headlights streak across the darkened street. For the first time, he felt the faint tremor of his own importance rising, something more substantial than the role Tom had boxed him into. Maybe Clara saw something in him that Tom refused to see. Maybe she knew something Tom had never cared enough to ask. And maybe it was time Arthur stopped hiding behind silence. He folded Sophie's letter, set it beside Clara's email, and exhaled slowly. The fear was still there, but behind it was something steadier, something like resolve. He knew he couldn't stay passive anymore. Not with Tom, not with the truth about his past, not with the man he had let himself become. As the city lights flickered across his living room wall, Arthur made a quiet, decisive choice. This time he would act, even if Tom wasn't ready for what that meant. Arthur returned to the restaurant 2 days later, stepping inside alone this time, without Tom's sharp presence shadowing every movement. The late afternoon light filtered through the tall windows, washing the dining room in a warm, amber glow. It felt different walking in by himself, quieter, heavier, as though he were entering a place full of answers he wasn't sure he wanted. He paused near the entrance, taking in the familiar smell of aged wood and simmering herbs. The place had always brought him comfort, but today it felt charged, almost expectant. Clara noticed him before he even took a seat. She emerged from the back with the poised confidence she seemed to carry effortlessly, her gaze softening when she realized he had come alone. "Mr. Green," she greeted, her voice calm yet edged with purpose. "I was hoping you'd return." Arthur gave a small nod, unsure how to begin. He didn't want to burden her with his personal turmoil, and yet something about her made silence feel impossible. Clara motioned toward a small corner booth, one tucked away from the rest of the restaurant, the kind of place where difficult truths could unfold without interruption. Once they sat, Clara folded her hands on the table. "I meant what I wrote," she began gently. "There's more to your connection to this place than you realize or than others remember." Arthur's brow furrowed. "I don't understand. I was just a loyal customer. I've been coming here for years, yes, but—" Clara shook her head slowly. "Before that, long before the restaurant became what it is now. There was something in her tone, something anchored in certainty, that made Arthur lean back slightly, trying to sift through the fog of distant memories. He had worked so many odd jobs in his youth, helped so many small businesses during the years he hustled to keep his family afloat. The past was layered, scattered, easy to overlook, but Clara's expression suggested she wasn't mistaken. "You were here in the early days," she continued, "when the first owner was struggling to keep the place alive. You weren't just a customer, Arthur. You helped build this restaurant's foundation, with finances, with ideas, with long hours no one ever credited you for." Arthur stared at her, stunned. "That was decades ago," he murmured. "I barely think about it anymore." "But I do," Clara replied. "My mother told me stories about the quiet young man who offered loyalty when the restaurant needed it most, someone who never asked for recognition." Her voice softened further. "Someone who disappeared from the narrative because he let others take the credit." A strange ache unfolded in Arthur's chest, not sadness exactly, but something older, something buried. Memories surfaced, helping repaint the walls during a renovation, offering advice on menu pricing, lending money he could barely spare because he believed in the place. He had never called attention to any of it. He simply did what felt right, and then life moved on. Marriage, work, responsibilities, and Tom. "When I saw how your son spoke to you," Clara added quietly, "I couldn't stay silent anymore. He has no idea who you really are, Arthur. No idea what you've done. No idea of your strength." Her words sliced through him with painful clarity. Tom didn't know. Tom had never asked. Tom didn't care. And Arthur had allowed that ignorance to grow untouched for years. The door opened in the distance, pulling Arthur's attention for a moment. Tom walked in, spotting Arthur immediately. His expression shifted into something irritated. An inconvenience had entered his day. He approached the booth with a scoff. "Really, Dad? You're having meetings with the owner now," Tom muttered. "What's next, giving her your life savings too?" The jab was instantaneous, reflexive, and dismissive. Clara's eyes narrowed slightly, but she said nothing. Arthur felt the familiar sting of Tom's words, but this time, something inside him resisted the pain. Something pushed back. He looked at Tom, not with the helpless guilt he usually felt, but with a quiet, awakening certainty. "Tom," he said, voice steady, "you don't need to speak to me that way." Tom scoffed again. "Relax, Dad, it was a joke." But it wasn't a joke, not to Arthur, not anymore. As Tom walked away, shaking his head, Arthur felt Clara watching him again, not pitying him, not judging him, but assessing the shift beginning in him. "You've carried silence like armor," she said softly once Tom was out of earshot. "But silence can also be a prison. You have more power than you believe, Arthur, and you have every right to reclaim it." Her words lingered like the first warm breeze before a storm. Arthur's hands rested on the table, steady now, no longer trembling. He realized then that he had been living in the shadow of his own restraint for too long, allowing Tom to shape a version of him that wasn't true. A version Clara, Sophie, and even the restaurant itself knew was incomplete. A new thought formed, a dangerous, necessary seed. It was time to confront the past. Time to reclaim what he had once built. Time to stop letting Tom define him. As he stood to leave, Clara's voice followed him gently. "When you're ready, Arthur, there is a path forward, one that starts with telling the truth, especially to the one who refuses to see it." Arthur paused, the weight of her words settling deep within him. For the first time in years, he felt something potent rising inside him. Not fear, not guilt, something sharper, something that would change everything. Tom hadn't planned on returning to the restaurant so soon, but curiosity and something darker pulled him back. Arthur had been acting strange, and Tom hated not knowing why. As he pushed through the front doors, he expected to find his father sitting alone, nursing a glass of water like always. but instead he found Clara standing near the corner booth, speaking quietly with Arthur. And they weren't just exchanging small talk. There was an intensity there, a familiarity Tom had never seen. Her eyes flicked toward Tom the moment he approached, and Arthur straightened a little, as if bracing for impact. Tom forced out a laugh. "What, Dad? You having secret business meetings now?" The joke was sharp, a little too loud, meant to cut. Clara didn't smile. Instead, she stepped closer, her expression cool and precise, like someone about to reveal a truth she'd been holding for far too long. "Tom," she said, "your father isn't here on business. He's here because he's earned the right to know the role he played in this place." Tom frowned, confused, irritated. "What are you talking about? He just eats here, that's it." Arthur didn't speak, he simply watched. Clara continued, "Your father helped build the foundation of this restaurant decades ago, financially, strategically, emotionally. Without him, this place wouldn't exist in the form you see today." The words hit Tom with the force of a dropped weight. He blinked, unable to disguise the shock. "My father, him?" His voice pitched higher, disbelief laced with something uglier. "He never told me that." "He didn't need to," Clara replied softly. "Quiet people rarely do, but the truth stands." Tom looked at Arthur, suddenly feeling as if the room had shifted beneath him. The version of his father he'd always clung to, the weak, passive, insignificant man, didn't fit with what Clara was saying. He felt heat rising to his face, not from pride or admiration, but from humiliation. "Why didn't you say anything?" Tom demanded, his words cracking. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" Arthur met his son's eyes, calm in a way Tom had never seen before. "You never asked." That simple sentence, steady, unblaming, factual, struck Tom deep, deeper than any lecture could have. It was as if the ground beneath his pride gave way, exposing the pettiness he'd built his resentment on. He felt small, exposed, and suddenly furious not at Arthur, but at himself. Clara folded her arms, watching Tom with a mixture of disappointment and quiet challenge. "Arthur's humility has been both his strength and his wound," she said. "He gave without asking for anything back. But that doesn't mean he wasn't vital. People like him rarely get the recognition they deserve." Tom's chest tightened. Shame clawed at him, but he swallowed it, masking his emotion with a familiar scowl. "So what? You two decided to rewrite history together." Arthur didn't flinch. "This isn't revision, Tom, it's truth, a truth you never cared to see." Tom opened his mouth to argue, but nothing came out, because for the first time, he felt the weight of his own ignorance. The years he'd spent building an image of Arthur that was easier to belittle than understand. Across the room, David approached slowly, sensing the tension but refusing to shy away. He stood beside Arthur, speaking softly. "Mr. Green, sometimes people only learn the value of something after they've ignored it too long." His eyes flicked toward Tom. "But that doesn't mean it's too late to claim your worth." The comment wasn't meant to provoke Tom, but it did. Tom shot David a glare before looking back at Arthur, who sat taller than he ever had in his son's presence. There was a new steadiness in him, a quiet power Tom couldn't deny. Clara moved closer to Arthur, laying a light hand on the back of his chair. "You gave this place your time, your ideas, your heart. It's time others knew that, including your son." Arthur took in her words, letting them settle into the fractures inside him. Clara wasn't flattering him. She was naming something he had buried so deeply he'd almost forgotten it existed. Recognition, after all these years, felt both freeing and painful. Tom watched, bewildered. The father he dismissed as weak was suddenly at the center of a story Tom had never bothered to understand. His humiliation twisted inward, his arrogance recoiled, and something in him, something uncomfortable and sharp, began to crack. Arthur looked at Tom, and for the first time he didn't feel small. He didn't feel dismissed. He felt seen, not just by Clara or David, but by himself. This wasn't about revenge anymore, not entirely. It was about reclaiming pieces of himself he'd allowed the world, and especially his son, to erase. Tom swallowed hard, searching for words that wouldn't come. And Arthur, quiet, steady, awakening, felt the first true shift of power settling firmly in his hands. A shift Tom wasn't ready for. A shift Arthur no longer intended to give back. Arthur walked out of the restaurant that evening with a different kind of weight on his shoulders. Heavy, yes, but no longer crushing. It was the weight of realization, of possibility. The truth Clara had revealed about his role in the restaurant's origins had stirred something inside him, something that had been dormant for years. As he stepped into the cool Chicago air, he found himself thinking about leverage, not in a manipulative, vindictive sense, but in the sense of finally having something solid beneath his feet, something he could stand on when facing Tom. For the first time in a long time, Arthur felt a sense of steadiness that didn't come from staying silent. It came from knowing he wasn't as small or as irrelevant as Tom had always made him feel. But Tom, sensing the shift, though not understanding it, reacted the only way he knew how, with entitlement disguised as dominance. 2 days later, Tom showed up at Arthur's apartment unannounced. He barged in with the same loud energy he always carried, as though the world were something he could push aside with sheer force. "Dad, we need to talk," he said, tossing his jacket onto the couch like he owned the place. "I've been thinking about things, and honestly, I think you're being dramatic." Arthur remained seated at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a warm mug. "About what, Tom?" "About all this restaurant nonsense," Tom replied, waving a hand dismissively. "Clara's just trying to make you feel special. You're taking it too seriously. You're letting it get in your head." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "You and I both know you're not built for anything big. That's why you always stayed in the background." Arthur didn't respond, but this time his silence wasn't submission, it was calculation. Tom mistook it for weakness. Maya's voice came loud and clear from the hallway. She must have followed Tom up without Arthur noticing. "Honestly, Arthur," she chimed as she strutted inside, "I think you're letting other people influence you. This whole transformation, it feels fake, and Tom's worried about you." Arthur glanced at them both. Maya, with her polished smile and calculating eyes, pushed Tom's worst impulses in the guise of loyalty. She whispered poison into his ear and called it ambition. "You should talk to Clara less," Maya continued. "She's filling your head with ideas, and Tom doesn't want to see you get hurt." Arthur almost laughed at the irony, but he held it in. Later that afternoon, seeking clarity rather than conflict, Arthur returned to the restaurant, where Clara was reviewing paperwork at her favorite back table. She looked up immediately when he approached. "You look conflicted," she said gently. Arthur sat down, the air thick with everything unspoken. "Tom thinks I'm imagining things, that what you told me doesn't matter, that I don't matter." Clara's gaze sharpened, not with anger but with resolve. "Arthur, your contributions built this place's foundation. Just because you didn't boast about them doesn't make them less real. You gave your time, your money, your ideas. This restaurant remembers, even if the people closest to you don't." Arthur swallowed hard. "It feels strange, thinking I might have more power than I've ever used." "That's not strange," Clara said softly. "It's overdue." Their conversation lingered between them, a quiet pact. Clara wasn't pushing him into revenge, she was reminding him that he had the right to take up space, the right to reclaim what he had lost through decades of self-erasure. David approached then, careful as always, sensing the emotional currents around Arthur. "Mr. Green," he said, his voice low, "I know things are shifting, but be careful. Anger can blind you as fast as silence can bind you." He set a glass of water on the table. "Whatever you choose next, choose it because it brings you peace, not because it hurts someone else." Arthur nodded, appreciating the sincerity in David's warning. It grounded him, reminding him of the difference between reclaiming dignity and seeking destruction. But that clarity was shattered later that night when Tom called, voice tight, frustrated and dripping with manipulation. "Dad," he said, sounding wounded, "I feel like you're abandoning me, like you don't care about my future anymore. Clara gets one idea in your head and suddenly you're acting different. I'm your son. Don't I matter more than some old story about a restaurant?" Arthur heard the lie behind the words, the practiced desperation. Tom wasn't afraid of losing his father. He was afraid of losing control. And for the first time, Arthur felt no guilt in recognizing that truth. He let Tom finish, let him push and pull, let him play the victim. But Arthur's response was steady, unshaken. "Tom," he said quietly, "I'm done letting you decide who I am." The line went silent. And in that silence, Arthur made a decision, one that had been forming since the moment Clara told him the truth. He was going to reclaim his dignity. And Tom would finally have to face the man he had underestimated for far too long. Arthur spent the next 2 days in a quiet, deliberate kind of preparation. Not the kind of planning that involved strategy meetings or rehearsed speeches, just slow, steady thinking. He replayed past arguments with Tom, the moments he had backed down, the times he had let silence protect him instead of truth. He stood in front of the bathroom mirror longer than usual that morning, studying the face staring back at him. The lines were deeper, the gray more prom. But behind his eyes there was something he hadn't seen in years: intention. He sat at the kitchen table with a notepad jotting small reminders, truths he wanted to speak aloud, boundaries he had never dared to set, clarity he owed himself. His hands trembled slightly, but not from fear, from the gravity of what he knew was coming. By evening he had made his decision. He called Tom and Maya, inviting them to a family dinner. Nothing dramatic, just the three of them. Tom accepted without hesitation, assuming it was another chance to lecture Arthur or extract some kind of advantage. Maya accepted too, her tone sugary but sharp underneath, as if she smelled opportunity. Tom arrived first, barging into the restaurant's private dining area without waiting to be greeted. Maya followed close behind, eyeing the room as though assessing its usefulness. Neither of them noticed Arthur's steady posture or the quiet resolve etched into his expression. "Dad," Tom said, plopping into his seat, "can you please not make this long? We have plans tonight." Arthur didn't answer right away. He simply lifted his gaze, letting the silence settle, not as surrender but as strength. For the first time in years, Tom shifted under the weight of it. Before Arthur could begin, David appeared at his side, carrying a tray of drinks. But instead of stepping away immediately, he leaned the slightest bit closer to Arthur. "Mr. Green," he whispered, "there's something you should know. The original owner, your contributions weren't just helpful, they were essential. This place survived because of you. Clara's mother told her that." Arthur felt a slow breath expand his chest. He had known pieces of this, but hearing it spoken plainly, without hesitation, without agenda, struck something deep inside him. "Thank you, David," he murmured. David gave a small nod before retreating, leaving Arthur with something he hadn't had before: confirmation. Tom rolled his eyes. "Are we done with the secret meetings? Or should I call Clara over too so we can all discuss how important Dad apparently used to be?" Arthur's calm didn't waver. "Sit down, Tom, we're talking tonight." The firmness in his voice startled both Tom and Maya. Arthur rarely used that tone. Tom bristled immediately, deflecting with hostility. "Oh, here we go," Tom snapped. "Another lecture, another guilt trip. Dad, just once can you admit that you held me back? Everything I struggled with, you were the reason." The words sliced through the room. Arthur inhaled slowly, then set his napkin on the table with deliberate care. "No, Tom, I won't carry your excuses anymore." His voice was low, steady. "You don't know who I was, you never asked, and you certainly never listened." Tom scoffed, his face reddening. "Oh, please, are we talking about that ridiculous restaurant story again?" Arthur leaned forward, meeting his son's eyes directly. "It's not a story. I helped build this place. I invested in it. I worked nights here before you were born, trying to give you the life you take for granted. You mocked me for being quiet, but you never bothered to learn the truth behind that silence." Tom stared at him, stunned. Maya stepped in, smoothing her voice with calculated sympathy. "Tom, don't let him guilt-trip you. He's trying to rewrite history because he feels bad. You know how he gets." Arthur cut her off with a calm that carried edge. "Maya, this is between my son and me." Something about the firmness shook Tom. His loyalty to Maya wavered for the first time. Her eyes narrowed, sensing her influence slipping. "Tom," Arthur continued, "your resentment isn't about my failures. It's about your refusal to see anything beyond your own disappointment." Tom's face twisted with conflict. He looked between Arthur and Maya, caught between the narrative he had clung to for years and the truth now forcing its way into the open. The tension thickened. Tom suddenly slammed his fist onto the table. "You don't get to talk to me like that. You think one little history lesson changes anything. You ruined my life." Arthur didn't flinch. "No, Tom, I stayed quiet so you wouldn't drown in mine." A long, charged silence fell over the table. Tom's breathing was ragged. Maya's eyes flicked nervously. And Arthur, he felt something shift inside him, a release, a reclaiming. He wasn't the quiet man who absorbed every blow anymore. He had finally spoken. And Tom, for the first time, didn't know how to respond. Arthur sat back, feeling the first taste of empowerment settle into his bones. The confrontation wasn't over. But now, Arthur was no longer afraid of where it would lead. Arthur spent the next week moving with a quiet, deliberate purpose. The confrontation at the family dinner had shaken something loose inside him, something he had kept locked away for decades. Now, armed with the truth of his past and the recognition he had never asked for, he began to reach out to people who still remembered who he once was. Former colleagues, early investors, and a few old friends who had drifted into the shadows of his life responded with surprising warmth. They remembered his hard work, his loyalty, his ideas that once carried weight in business conversations. And when Arthur mentioned the restaurant, doors that had long seemed locked began to open. He wasn't loud about it. He didn't brag. He simply reminded people of what they already knew, that he was a man who had once stood tall in Chicago's small business world before life and family responsibilities pulled him away. Slowly, subtly, Arthur found himself re-entering circles where his name still carried respect. This wasn't revenge. Not yet. It was positioning, reclaiming, preparing. Meanwhile, Tom spiraled. The shift in power unsettled him in ways he didn't understand. He had always counted on his father's silence, relied on it even. But now that silence had turned into something firmer, something dangerous. Tom felt the ground beneath him moving, and his instinctive response was desperation disguised as ambition. He reached out to old acquaintances, trying to prove he could build something without Arthur's help. He pitched business ideas to people who barely knew him, exaggerating his successes and hiding his failures. He begged for investments he had no plan to repay. Each conversation left him more frantic, more aware that he was losing control. Maya saw all of this, and instead of grounding him, she poured fuel into his growing panic. "Arthur is trying to overshadow you," she whispered late one night as Tom paced their apartment. "He's making moves behind your back. You can't let him steal your future. You have to get ahead of him now." Her words were honeyed but poisonous. She wasn't worried about Arthur or even Tom. She was worried about losing the comfortable life she had built on Tom's access to his father's resources. The more Arthur grew in confidence, the more Maya felt her influence slipping. And so she pushed Tom harder, into riskier deals, more reckless decisions, more public posturing, all while pretending to protect him. Arthur saw the fallout before Tom did. One afternoon, Clara called Arthur to the restaurant. She greeted him not with sympathy but with certainty, something solid and respectful. "Arthur," she said, guiding him into her office, "I've been thinking about what you told me, about what you contributed here. This restaurant was built on the backs of people who believed in it long before it became profitable. You deserve to be part of its future, not just its forgotten past." She slid a folder across the desk. Inside was an offer, formal, carefully written, and undeniably generous. A partnership. Arthur stared at the papers, feeling a tremor of disbelief. The idea of returning to something he had once helped shape, stepping back into a place where his ideas mattered, it overwhelmed him in a way he hadn't expected. Clara leaned forward. "This isn't charity. You've earned this. You have insight, history, and more influence than you realize. If you want this, it's yours." Arthur didn't answer right away, but a sense of dignity washed over him, warmer than pride, richer than validation. This was more than a business opportunity. It was a reclamation of identity. But later, as Arthur stepped out into the dining room, David intercepted him with quiet concern. "Mr. Green," he said, lowering his voice, "I think you should be careful. The more involved you get, the harder Tom is going to push back. He's not handling this well." David hesitated. "You deserve recognition, but just make sure you're doing this for yourself, not just to hurt him." Arthur absorbed the warning. David meant well, meant to shield him from a war he wasn't ready for. But Arthur was ready. Ready in a way he hadn't been in years. That readiness was tested sooner than he expected. Tom stormed into the restaurant the next evening, loud enough that several diners turned to watch. "Dad," he shouted, "we need to talk." Arthur stepped aside with him, calm as a still lake. Tom's anger hit in waves. Accusations, insults, disbelief that Arthur would dare take a role in his territory. "You're trying to embarrass me," Tom hissed. "You're doing this to ruin my image, to make me look weak." Arthur didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He simply held his ground with a clarity Tom had never seen before. "This isn't about you," Arthur said quietly. "It's about me taking back what I gave up." Tom's expression twisted with a mixture of fear and fury. Fear of losing control, fury that Arthur no longer bowed to him. Arthur stepped forward, the restaurant humming behind him like a stage set for the next act. "Tom," he said, "if you want a conversation about business, then we'll have it, here, as equals." Tom blinked, stunned. Arthur didn't look away. The silent war had begun. And Arthur was no longer fighting from the shadows. The restaurant was quieter than usual when Arthur arrived for the meeting he knew would define everything that came next. The dinner crowd had thinned, the lights dimmed to their evening glow. It felt less like a public space tonight and more like an arena, one he had avoided for years but now stepped into willingly. He waited near the corner booth Clara had reserved for them, steadying his breath as he heard the heavy footsteps approaching. Tom entered with the kind of restless energy that made people step aside without thinking. His expression was tight, jaw clenched, posture rigid with the tension he'd been carrying. Maya trailed behind him, her eyes sharp, scanning the room as if calculating potential advantage. "So," Tom said, sliding into the booth across from Arthur, "this is what you want now, meetings at your restaurant." Arthur kept his voice calm. "It's a place I helped build. I think I've earned a seat at the table." Tom's face twitched, a mix of surprise and irritation. Before he spoke, he leaned forward, lowering his voice into a tone meant to intimidate. "Dad, let me make something clear. Getting tied up with Clara, it won't end well for you. People are talking. You're out of your depth." Arthur met his gaze without flinching. "Threats don't suit you, Tom, especially empty ones." Tom stiffened, thrown off balance. He wasn't used to Arthur blocking the blow. Arthur continued, his voice controlled and unshakably steady. "I know more about this restaurant than you ever imagined. Its early struggles, its first investor, the man who kept it alive when everyone else walked away." He paused. "You've spent your life trying to outrun failure, but you never learned how to build anything. You just take. And when things fall apart, you look for someone to blame. Tom blinked rapidly, caught between fury and confusion. Maya stepped in quickly, sliding a hand onto Tom's arm. Arthur, maybe you're misunderstanding him. Tom's under a lot of pressure. Your sudden involvement here, it put him in a difficult position. Her voice was warm, too warm, dripping with manufactured concern. But the moment she spoke, Tom's eyebrow twitched, just slightly, as if even he sensed her words weren't helping. She pushed on, trying to regain control. You're letting Clara manipulate you. She's making you think you're more important to this place than you are. Arthur didn't even look at Maya. His attention stayed locked on Tom. Son, the only person manipulating you is sitting beside you. Tom's breath hitched, just enough for Maya to withdraw her hand. Dad, enough, Tom snapped, desperation peeking through the cracks. You don't get to judge me. You were never there when it mattered. That was the moment Arthur felt something snap inside, not anger but release. Years of silence, restraint, and self-blame rose to the surface. Tom, Arthur said quietly, I was there every time you needed me. You just didn't like the way I loved you. I didn't shout, I didn't demand, I didn't control, and somehow you interpreted that as weakness. His voice broke, just once before it steadied again. But what hurts most isn't your disrespect. It's how hard you've worked to rewrite my life so you never have to face your own failures. Tom stared at him, stunned. The words cracked something in the air between them. Arthur continued, the truth spilling out with clarity he had buried for decades. You belittled me to feel bigger. You blamed me so you didn't have to blame yourself. And I let you, because I thought silence would keep us connected. He shook his head. But all it did was teach you to despise me. For a moment, no one moved. Clara had been standing near the bar, pretending to rearrange menus, but really listening. Her eyes softened as she watched Arthur finally speak truths that had lived inside him far too long. She didn't approach or interfere. She simply held space, letting Arthur fight a battle he had avoided for most of his life. Tom's face twisted, torn between defensiveness and something rawer, fear maybe, or recognition. I didn't, Dad, I just... His voice faltered, and for a split second the facade cracked. But Maya leaned in again, whispering harshly, Don't let him guilt you. He's trying to cut you out. And just like that, Tom's uncertainty hardened into resistance. Arthur felt the shift, and with it came clarity. Tom, he said, tone final, I can't keep saving you from the consequences of your choices, or from yourself. He drew a slow breath. From this point on, I'm cutting you off, emotionally, financially, all of it. Tom froze. Maya's eyes widened. Arthur held the silence, letting the truth settle like a closing door. You want control, Tom, then stand on your own. Tom's mouth opened, but no words came out. Arthur rose from the booth, feeling the weight lift as he turned away, not in anger, but in the quiet certainty of a man reclaiming himself. This wasn't the end of their conflict. It was the beginning of the real reckoning still to come. The days following the confrontation at the restaurant unfolded with a slow, merciless weight. Tom had always believed he could bend his father back into submission, that Arthur's silence was permanent, unshakable. But now, stripped of that safety net, he felt the consequences descend like cold rain. For the first time in years, Tom found his calls unanswered, his messages unread. The financial accounts he had relied on were suddenly his responsibility. Maya grew distant, irritated by his growing instability. The world that had once seemed wide open now felt narrow, unforgiving, and unbearably real. Tom sat in his apartment on a Tuesday afternoon, surrounded by unopened bills, failed business proposals, and the remnants of a life built on assumption rather than effort. His throat tightened as he realized just how much he had leaned on Arthur, not just financially, but emotionally, even if he had never admitted it. Now the silence between them wasn't his choice. It was a sentence, and it forced him to confront the truth he had avoided for too long. His downfall was Arthur's doing. It was his own. Meanwhile, Arthur carried his own quiet heaviness. He had expected relief after cutting Tom off, and part of him did feel it. A small, steady flame of dignity burning where there had once been hesitation. But the emotional toll remained. He found himself waking in the early hours of the morning, staring at the ceiling, replaying Tom's stunned expression, wondering if there was a better way, a softer path he had missed. Parenting didn't stop when a child grew up. The love didn't vanish. Neither did the guilt. Clara noticed it almost immediately. She invited Arthur to the restaurant after hours, where the two sat across from each other in the warm, quiet glow of the empty dining room. She offered him tea, then offered him something deeper, perspective. "You didn't abandon him," she said gently. "You set a boundary, there's a difference." Arthur nodded, though his eyes lingered on the table. "I know, but it feels like I gave up on him." Clara shook her head. "You didn't give up. You stepped back so he could face himself. He's never done that before." Her calm confidence soothed him, grounding him in a truth he struggled to hold on his own. Clara became a steady presence, never intrusive, never pushy, simply there, helping him navigate the hollow ache left behind as he rebuilt pieces of himself he hadn't touched in decades. But while Arthur began healing, Tom's world continued to crumble. His business partners pulled out of a deal after he failed to deliver the paperwork on time, another casualty of his emotional chaos. Friends he once bragged to now avoided him, sensing the desperation beneath his forced confidence. Maya, once his greatest ally, started to recoil. She hated instability, and Tom was unraveling in real time. "You need to fix this with your father," she snapped one night, stuffing her belongings into a glossy black purse. "I didn't sign up for all this." Tom tried to stop her, insisting that he just needed more time, but Maya was already pulling away, emotionally, physically, completely. His failure made him less attractive. His vulnerability irritated her. When she finally ended things, it wasn't dramatic. It was cold, efficient, and final. "You're not the man I thought you were," she said before shutting the door. For Tom, it was a blow far sharper than he expected. Maya had been the voice that fueled him, the validation he mistook for love. Losing her left him stripped of the last layer of pretense he'd been clinging to. Across town, Arthur continued showing up at the restaurant, taking part in small decisions Clara trusted him with. His presence grew stronger, steadier. David noticed the difference one afternoon and approached him with quiet honesty. "You're changing," David said. "In a good way, you're standing taller." Arthur chuckled softly. "It's been a long time coming." David's expression softened. "Just remember, moving forward doesn't mean forgetting the past, but it does mean not letting it control you anymore." Arthur held onto those words. They resonated deeply. Still, when he heard through acquaintances how Tom's ventures were failing, when he glimpsed Tom's name attached to desperate networking attempts online, Arthur felt a pang of conflicting emotions. Vindication, yes, but also heartbreak. Watching your child fall, no matter how justified, was its own kind of punishment. One evening, Clara joined him outside the restaurant, where he stood staring at the fading Chicago skyline. "You can be proud of yourself," she said quietly. "You did what you needed to do." Arthur didn't look at her immediately. He kept his gaze on the horizon, his voice low and contemplative. "I know, but winning doesn't feel like winning when your own son is the one breaking." Clara didn't offer hollow comfort. She simply stood beside him, sharing the silence. Arthur had reclaimed his dignity. But the victory tasted bittersweet. And as night settled over the city, Arthur couldn't shake the feeling that the most difficult part of the journey was still ahead, because breaking ties was one thing. Living with the cost was another. Arthur arrived early at the restaurant that morning, slipping through the side entrance Clara had given him access to. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, landing in soft pools across the empty dining room. For years, Arthur had walked into this place as a customer, quiet, unnoticed, carrying the weight of a man who believed he had long ago spent whatever worth he once had. Now he entered with purpose. Clara had given him responsibilities, real ones. Reviewing staff schedules, tasting menu updates, walking the floor before opening. Minor tasks, perhaps, but each one stitched a piece of dignity back into him. With every step he felt more grounded, more present, more himself. For the first time in years, Arthur allowed himself to breathe without apology. There was no Tom towering over his decisions, no guilt spinning quietly inside his chest. Just Arthur, the man he once was, the man he was becoming again. Clara found him near the kitchen pass, studying the morning prep. "You look different," she said softly, leaning against the counter. Arthur gave a small smile. "I feel different." Clara nodded, watching him with a warmth that wasn't romantic but deeply human. "Redemption isn't loud," she said. "It's slow, it's quiet, it starts here." She gently touched her chest. "You're letting go of something heavy." Arthur's gaze softened. "Resentment," he admitted. "It's been eating at me for years, and I didn't even realize how much until I stopped feeding it." Clara rested a hand on the counter beside him. "Forgiveness isn't about Tom. It's about freeing yourself from the version of you he forced you to become." Arthur didn't answer right away. He stood there, staring at the stainless steel surface reflecting his face, lined, tired, but no longer defeated. While Arthur rebuilt, Tom was free-falling. It happened slowly at first. Another rejected loan application, another friend slipping away, another night staring at the mess he had made of his life. The silence between him and Arthur, a silence Tom once welcomed, now felt suffocating. With Maya gone and his business prospects collapsing, he found himself face to face with a truth he had never wanted to acknowledge. He was the architect of his own downfall. Late one night, Tom sat on the floor of his apartment, surrounded by unpaid bills and the remnants of his ego. For once, he didn't blame Arthur. He didn't blame the world. He didn't blame circumstance. He blamed himself. And in that ache, raw, unfamiliar, something shifted. Tom picked up his phone, staring at Arthur's name for nearly a full minute before pressing call. His hand trembled as the line rang. Arthur was in his living room when he saw the caller ID. His breath caught. The world seemed to still around him as he answered. "Dad," Tom's voice cracked just slightly. I'm sorry." Arthur sank into the chair, eyes closing as Tom continued. "I've been wrong about a lot, about you, about everything." His words stumbled painfully but honestly. "I don't expect forgiveness. I don't even know if I deserve it. I just needed to say it." For years, Arthur had longed for these words. Yet now, hearing them, he felt something twist inside him, a mix of tenderness and fear, love and caution, hope and old wounds reopening. "Tom," Arthur whispered, unsure how to bridge the chasm between them. His instinct was to rush in, to fix, to comfort. But another part of him, the part Clara had helped strengthen, knew he had to move carefully. "I'm glad you called," Arthur said finally. "But this isn't something we can mend in a single conversation." "I know," Tom murmured. "I just didn't want you to think I hated you." Arthur felt the words land deep inside him, in a place still healing. After they hung up, Arthur sat in silence, wrestling with the emotional tug-of-war inside him. He had fought so hard to reclaim his dignity. Yet here was his son, broken, remorseful, lost, and Arthur's heart still reached for him despite everything. Later that evening, Clara found him sitting alone at a corner table, the lights dim, his thoughts heavy. "You heard from him," she said softly. Arthur nodded. He apologized for the first time in years. "And how do you feel?" Arthur exhaled slowly. "Conflicted. Part of me wants to protect myself. The other part, he's still my son." Clara placed a gentle hand over his. "Forgiveness doesn't erase the past. It just frees you from reliving it. You don't have to choose between dignity and compassion. You can have both." Arthur let her words settle, anchoring him. Finally he nodded. You're right, if Tom wants to meet, I think I owe him that. Clara smiled softly. It's a start, just a start. Arthur looked toward the restaurant's entrance, imagining Tom walking through it someday, not in anger but in humility. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, Arthur felt ready to walk it. With boundaries, with strength, with hope, and with the understanding that healing, real healing, was only just beginning. Arthur arrived early at the small cafe Clara had suggested, neutral ground, gentle lighting, a quiet corner where two men with too much history could speak without an audience. He sat by the window, hands wrapped around a cup of cooling tea, watching rain streak softly down the glass. The weight of what he was about to do pressed on him, not as fear but as something raw and unsteady. This was the first time he would see Tom since their confrontation, since the night he cut him off. The silence that followed had been both a relief and a wound. He exhaled slowly when the door opened. Tom stepped inside, shoulders tense, eyes scanning until they landed on Arthur. He looked thinner, tired in a way that wasn't physical but emotional, as if life had been pressing on him from all sides. For a brief second, the anger Arthur had once associated with Tom wasn't there. Instead, he saw uncertainty, vulnerability, shame. Tom approached cautiously, almost hesitant. "Dad," he said quietly. Arthur nodded. "Tom." They stood in awkward silence for a moment before Tom slid into the seat across from him. The air between them felt heavy, charged, with things they had avoided saying for years, suddenly demanding attention. Tom swallowed, his voice trembling at the edges. I didn't think you'd actually meet me." Arthur didn't rush to fill the silence. He simply waited, giving Tom the space to speak. Tom rubbed his palms against his jeans, his composure fracturing. "I'm sorry," he finally said, "for everything, for how I treated you, for the things I said." His voice cracked softly. "I was angry and stupid and wrong. You didn't deserve any of it." Arthur's chest tightened. Hearing the apology was a relief, but also painful, like finally removing a splinter that had been buried too deep. Tom continued, words now spilling in a quiet rush. "I blamed you because it was easier than blaming myself. I didn't want to admit I messed up. I didn't want to face the fact that my failures were mine, not yours." He drew a shaky breath. "And I hurt you because I couldn't handle my own disappointment." Arthur listened without judgment, really listened, and the memories washed through him. All the insults, the dismissive remarks, the entitlement, the coldness. They didn't vanish, but they softened in the light of Tom's honesty. When Tom finally looked up, his eyes were glassy. "I know I can't undo anything. I know I broke something between us, and I don't expect you to forgive me today or ever. I just wanted you to hear it from me." Arthur's fingers tightened around his cup before he set it down gently. "Tom," he said, voice steady but hushed, "I'm not going to pretend your words didn't hurt. They did, deeply." He paused, searching for the balance between honesty and compassion. "But I also know that silence allowed those wounds to grow. Mine and yours." Tom's gaze lowered, shame rippling through him. Arthur continued, "You're taking responsibility now. That matters more than you think." They sat there, not as father and son locked in old roles, but as two flawed, hurting men trying to find their way back to something that once mattered. Across the cafe, Clara entered quietly. She didn't approach the table, choosing instead to give Arthur space while offering him a reassuring nod from afar. Her presence, calm, steady, was the vote of confidence he needed. Tom noticed her too. For once, there was no jealousy, no irritation. Just understanding that Clara had helped Arthur through a chapter Tom didn't have access to. As the conversation wound down, neither of them claimed resolution. Arthur didn't rush to forgive, and Tom didn't push for absolution. But something had shifted, subtle yet unmistakable. They no longer felt like enemies trapped in a cycle of blame. They felt like two people standing at the beginning of a difficult but possible path. When the bill arrived, Tom reached for it, then paused. "If it's all right, I'd like to pay," he said softly. Arthur didn't argue. Outside, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. They stood beneath the awning, facing each other once more. Tom's voice was low. "I know things won't be easy, and I don't know how to fix everything, but I'll try. I want to try." Arthur studied him, really studied him, and saw not the entitled, angry man he'd fought for so long, but the bruised son beneath it all. "I believe you," Arthur said. Tom nodded, relief flickering in his expression before he walked away, shoulders still heavy, but lighter than when he had arrived. Arthur remained under the awning, watching him disappear down the wet street. For the first time in years, a small spark warmed his chest. Not certainty, not forgiveness. Hope. The fragile beginning of something worth fighting for, if both of them had the courage to continue. The weeks that followed felt like walking across a bridge still under construction, steady enough to move forward but fragile in ways neither Arthur nor Tom dared to test too quickly. Their meetings were cautious, almost ceremonial at first. A quiet lunch here, a short walk there. They avoided heavy topics, sticking to neutral ground, but even neutrality carried tension. Every silence felt loaded, every question carefully measured. Yet despite the awkwardness, they kept showing up. And that, Arthur realized, already meant something. Arthur found himself studying Tom differently during these meetings, not the man who had wounded him, but the man trying, with visible discomfort, to repair the damage. Tom would fumble through apologies he didn't know how to phrase, or pause mid-sentence as if afraid of saying the wrong thing again. And in those moments, Arthur sensed sincerity, even if it came wrapped in uncertainty. Still, the internal challenge lingered. Forgiveness wasn't a switch Arthur could flip. It was a slow unwinding of years of hurt, and some days he felt progress, while other days old resentment resurfaced without warning. Clara saw the struggle even before Arthur admitted it aloud. She often met with him after his outings with Tom, offering quiet guidance while they sat in the soft glow of the restaurant's evening L. "It's forgiveness isn't about forgetting," she would say, her voice calm and steady. "It's choosing not to carry the weight anymore, not for his sake, for yours." Arthur knew she was right. Letting go wasn't surrender, it was release. But release required vulnerability, and vulnerability had never come easily to him. Tom faced his own challenges, though he rarely spoke of them. He wanted to earn back Arthur's trust, but he understood, perhaps for the first time, that trust wasn't owed, it was built. And rebuilding meant work, real work. So Tom started making changes in his daily life. He cut ties with people who fed his arrogance. He took responsibility for past debts. He sought advice instead of assuming he knew everything. He even admitted to friends that he had been wrong about Arthur, words that tasted unfamiliar on his tongue. During one of their lunches, Arthur noticed a subtle shift in Tom. It wasn't dramatic, nothing cinematic. It was in the way Tom listened, really listened, without interrupting or deflecting. It was in the way he hesitated before responding, weighing his words carefully. It was humility, understated but unmistakable. Arthur sipped his coffee, observing him. For years he had prayed for this version of Tom, quieter, softer, grounded in something other than ego. Now that it was here, Arthur wasn't sure what to do with the unfamiliar warmth that pressed into his chest. Sophie noticed it too. She invited Arthur over for tea one afternoon, something she hadn't done in a long time. "He's changing," she said, not with naive optimism but with cautious hope. "I've seen him take responsibility in ways I never imagined. He asks how you're doing more than he asks how your money is doing. That's new." Arthur chuckled softly. "It feels strange, good but strange." Other family members chimed in over time, nieces, cousins, even Sophie's sister, mentioning how Tom seemed more grounded lately, more present. Arthur took each comment with quiet gratitude. It wasn't validation he needed, but reassurance that his son's progress wasn't just something he imagined. Yet progress didn't erase the past. Arthur still felt tension on certain days, especially when old wounds resurfaced at unexpected moments. There were times he caught himself pulling back emotionally, afraid of being hurt again. Tom, sensing it, would give him space instead of reacting with anger or defensiveness. That, too, was new. One evening, Arthur and Tom walked along the Chicago River after dinner. The city lights shimmered across the water, a mirrored dance of gold and blue. They didn't speak much, but the silence felt different, no longer suffocating, no longer hostile, just quiet, companionable. Tom glanced at him. "I know I can't fix everything," he said softly, "but I'm trying, Dad, I promise." Arthur nodded, feeling the truth in those words settle deeply. He didn't offer instant reassurance. He didn't force a connection. He simply placed a hand on Tom's shoulder, small, steady enough. When they parted ways that night, Arthur lingered by the water, watching the ripples expand and fade. The journey ahead was long, the scars weren't gone, and the trust wasn't fully rebuilt. But for the first time in decades, Arthur felt something he almost didn't recognize. Hope, not blind hope, earned hope. And as he walked home beneath the quiet Chicago night, he understood something clearly. The road ahead wasn't easy, but it was beginning. Tom's next challenge arrived without warning, an unexpected financial audit tied to one of his struggling business ventures. For years, he had run things loosely, recklessly, assuming that charm and confidence could fix what discipline never did. But this time, the stakes were different. The legal language in the letter was cold, sharp, and unforgiving. If he didn't resolve the discrepancies quickly, he could lose more than just the business. His already fractured reputation could shatter completely. Tom sat alone in his apartment, the papers spread across the table like accusations. His first instinct was the instinct he'd always had: call Arthur. Let his father fix what he couldn't. Let the man he once dismissed step in again as the quiet safety net Tom never acknowledged. His fingers hovered over Arthur's name on his phone, then stopped. He lowered the phone slowly, exhaling. "No," he whispered to himself, "I have to do this." It wasn't pride this time. It was responsibility. Meanwhile, Arthur received the news through a mutual acquaintance. Concern clamped at his chest immediately. A familiar instinct surged, to protect Tom, to shield him, to keep him from the consequences he'd spent his life outrunning. But this time, the instinct fought with something new, the knowledge that stepping in too quickly might undo everything Tom had worked to rebuild. That evening, Arthur sought out Clara in her office, her presence a steadying force. She listened quietly as he explained the situation, his worry bleeding into every W. "Ord, I don't know what to do," Arthur admitted. "He's struggling, really struggling, and if I step back now, it feels cruel." Clara leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "Arthur, every step Tom has taken these past weeks has been toward becoming his own man. If you rush in now, you risk teaching him the same lesson he learned all his life, that someone will always save him." Arthur looked down at his hands, the weight of her words pressing into him. "But what if he fails?" "Then he learns," Clara replied. "Growth doesn't happen without pressure. Trust him, Arthur. Trust the man he's becoming." Her advice echoed in his mind long after he left the restaurant. Tom, meanwhile, was deep in the hardest work he'd ever done. He stayed up late reviewing documents, calling accountants, facing uncomfortable truths about his own negligence. Every step was humbling, every phone call a confrontation with the version of himself he was trying to leave behind. There were moments he wanted to quit, moments he felt the familiar pull of anger or self-pity, but he pushed through each one. For the first time, Tom wasn't trying to impress anyone. He wasn't trying to be the son who outshined his father or the partner Maya once expected him to be. He was simply trying to take responsibility. Arthur watched from the sidelines, resisting the urge to intervene. He checked on Tom indirectly through small signals, a brief text, a question to a mutual contact, but he didn't step in. It wasn't indifference, it was discipline, it was trust, and it was excruciating. One afternoon, just as Arthur filled out paperwork in the restaurant's office, his phone buzzed. "Tom, Dad, I think I fixed it." Arthur's breath stalled. He replied simply, "Tell me more." Minutes later, Tom called, his voice unsteady but alive with something Arthur hadn't heard in years. Pride, not arrogance, not ego, earned pride. "I did it," Tom said. "The auditors accepted my revisions. They cleared the case. I actually handled it, Dad, on my own." Arthur closed his eyes, letting the relief wash through him. It wasn't just that Tom succeeded, it was how he succeeded. Through effort, accountability, humility. "That's good, Tom," Arthur said softly. "That's really good." There was a pause on the other end, long, meaningful. "I wanted you to step in," Tom admitted. "A few times, but I knew if I leaned on you I'd never change." Arthur felt something loosen in his chest, something he hadn't realized was still clenched. "I'm proud of you," he said, "truly." Silence settled between them, not tense this time, but warm enough to hint at what could be possible. Their relationship remained delicate, like fresh paint not yet dry, but it was no longer fractured. There was trust beginning to form where resentment once lived, and hope blooming in small, cautious increments. Later that evening, Arthur walked the quiet streets of Chicago, the city lights reflecting off the river. He felt lighter, not because everything was fixed, but because for the first time in decades, Tom had stood up on his own, and Arthur had allowed him to. The road ahead was still long, still uneven. But now father and son were walking it, slowly, separately, yet somehow together. And Arthur couldn't help but feel that this small victory was the beginning of something real. Tom's progress had been real but fragile, like new growth after a wildfire, still soft, still vulnerable. For a few weeks, he moved with a quiet sense of direction. He managed his responsibilities more carefully, kept his temper in check, and even started sketching ideas for a new business venture. It wasn't grand or flashy. It was modest, practical, something that reflected the new, more grounded version of him. But progress is rarely linear. The venture faltered almost immediately. A key supplier backed out. Costs doubled. Investors grew uneasy. Tom tried to stay calm, but old anxieties resurfaced, clawing at his composure. He spent late nights poring over spreadsheets and early mornings pacing his apartment, whispering reassurances to himself that he no longer believed. The business wasn't just struggling, it was collapsing. And this time, there was no Maya to distract him with false promises, no friends to inflate his ego. The consequences he had avoided for years finally stood in front of him, demanding payment. Meanwhile, Arthur began to notice subtle changes, Tom canceling their lunches, responding to messages with short, clipped replies, and sounding increasingly tired during phone calls. Concern pulled at Arthur like a familiar old thread, but so did caution. Helping Tom too quickly could undo everything they had built. He had learned that support without boundaries was not love, it was sabotage. Still, the worry gnawed at him. Clara noticed before he even told her. She always did. "You're somewhere else today," she said gently one afternoon as they walked through the restaurant during prep hours. Arthur sighed. "It's Tom, something's wrong but he won't talk about it." Clara gave him a sympathetic look. "You can care for him without carrying him. That balance is hard, especially for a parent." Arthur nodded, but the conflict lingered like a knot in his chest. The knot tightened the next day when Tom finally reached out, not with excuses, not with anger, but with something Arthur had never heard in his son's voice before: fear. "Dad, I need to talk to you." The quiet tremor in Tom's tone told Arthur everything. When they met later that evening at the small cafe where their reconciliation had first begun, Tom looked exhausted. Not physically, but emotionally, like a man stripped of all his defenses. He sat down, shoulders hunched, fingers trembling against the edge of the table. "I messed up," he admitted, breath unsteady. "The new venture, it's failing. Worse than failing. If I don't fix this, I'm ruined." Arthur listened without interrupting, letting Tom navigate the difficult terrain of his own honesty. "I thought I could handle it," Tom continued. "I wanted to prove I was different, that I could actually build something, and I tried, Dad, I really did, but it's falling apart." He swallowed hard. "I need help, not a bailout, not money thrown at the problem. I need you, your guidance, your experience, anything you're willing to give." The words landed heavily. For the first time in their strained history, Tom wasn't blaming Arthur. He wasn't manipulating him. He was asking, not as a son entitled to rescue, but as a man humbled by consequences. Arthur felt an ache at the sincerity in Tom's eyes, but also fear. Helping Tom too much could send him spiraling back into dependency, but refusing him entirely could break the fragile trust they had begun rebuilding. It was a test of Tom's growth and Arthur's boundaries. Later that night, Arthur sat with Clara in her quiet office, papers spread across the desk, lamps casting warm shadows across the walls. He told her everything. Clara listened, thoughtful as always. "Arthur, helping him isn't the problem, it's how you help him." Arthur looked up, meaning. Clara leaned forward. "Support him, but don't carry him. If he's truly changed, he'll take responsibility for the mess he made. He'll show you he's willing to put in the effort. If he doesn't, then your help would only hurt him." She paused. "This is the moment where you see if the man he's becoming is real." Arthur absorbed her words slowly. "And if he fails?" Clara met his eyes with quiet firmness. "Then he learns, but he learns on his feet, not in your shadow." The next morning, Arthur called Tom and asked to meet again, this time at the restaurant before opening hours. When Tom arrived, he looked nervous, almost bracing for disappointment. Arthur motioned for him to sit. "Tom," Arthur began, "I'm willing to help you, but not the way you expect." Tom's eyes widened and Arthur continued, "I won't fix this for you. I won't pay your way out of it, but I will give you guidance, structure, and accountability." Tom nodded slowly, absorbing every word. "This is your responsibility," Arthur said. "You will do the work, you will face the consequences, but you won't do it alone, not if you're committed." Tom's shoulders trembled with a mix of relief and shame, but for once, he didn't hide from it. "Thank you," he whispered. "I won't waste this chance." Arthur studied him carefully. The humility was real, the shame was real, the determination, tentative but genuine, was real too. He finally nodded. "Then let's start." For the first time, it didn't feel like parent rescuing child. It felt like two men standing on the edge of something new, uncertain, fragile, but undeniably possible. And Arthur knew the next step would determine everything that followed. Arthur had known helping Tom would come with consequences. Still, he wasn't prepared for how quickly the ripple effect would spread. Within days of stepping in quietly, cautiously, word began to circulate through old business circles that Arthur was involved in a messy situation. Some phrased it delicately, others not at all. "He's rescuing his son again," they whispered, as though Arthur were a man too weak to let go of old paternal habits. The comments were subtle but sharp enough to sting. His reputation, carefully rebuilt over the past several months, wobbled under the weight of the rumors. A few acquaintances canceled meetings with vague excuses. A potential partnership Clara had hoped to finalize for the restaurant was delayed after investors asked additional questions. Clara brushed it off publicly, but Arthur saw the frustration in her tightened smile. Sophie was even more blunt. She called him one evening, her tone a mix of worry and disappointment. "Arthur, I'm glad Tom is trying, I am, but you can't lose yourself again. Every time he stumbles, you rush back into the fire. Aren't you exhausted?" Arthur rubbed his temples, staring at the faint reflection of himself in the kitchen window. "It's different now," he insisted. "He's different." "Is he?" Sophie asked quietly. "Or are you just hoping he is because you want to believe this time won't break you again?" Her words stayed with him long after the call ended. Other relatives chimed in with their own opinions, some supportive, others wary. A cousin remarked, "Tom's always been manipulative, be careful." A nephew offered the more generous, "He seems to be trying Uncle Arthur. Maybe this is his turning point." The division was unmistakable. Half the family didn't trust Tom. The other half didn't trust Arthur's judgment. It left Arthur standing alone between two camps, trying to balance the weight of hope and fear. But Tom, despite everything, was changing. Slowly, painfully, but genuinely. He showed up for meetings with accountants, faced intimidating paperwork, and confronted overdue legal obligations he had long ignored. He didn't complain, didn't lash out, didn't blame anyone. He simply worked, shoulders heavy with consequences he could no longer outrun. There were nights he looked like he was wearing the past as a physical burden, eyes distant, posture slumped, as if each mistake he had made pressed down on him with fresh force. Once, after a grueling meeting, Tom sat across from Arthur at the cafe. "I deserved all this," he murmured. "Every bill, every penalty, all of it. I know I can't erase what I did." Arthur wanted to reassure him, but the words caught in his throat, because part of him still questioned whether stepping back in had been the right choice. Tom was trying. That much was clear. But was it enough? Would this new version of Tom last? Or was it temporary remorse dressed as growth? Those doubts gnawed at Arthur late at night. Even Clara noticed. "You're thinking yourself into knots again," she said gently as they closed up the restaurant one evening. She leaned against a table, arms crossed but expression soft. "Healing isn't neat, Arthur. It's not supposed to feel easy." Arthur sighed. "I just don't want to be a fool." "You're not," she replied. "You're a father, and fathers don't stop loving just because they stop rescuing. You set boundaries, you protected yourself. Helping him now doesn't erase that." Her words soothed him, but only slightly. He appreciated Clara's unwavering support, her ability to see straight through his defenses and fears, but the internal struggle remained. He wasn't just dealing with Tom's past. He was dealing with his own decades of silence, guilt, and buried resentment. Forgiveness was proving far more complicated than he ever imagined. Tom felt his own version of that burden. Even as he made progress, guilt clung to him like a shadow. He apologized often, sometimes too often, catching himself in loops of self-blame that Arthur didn't always know how to break. "I shouldn't need your help," he muttered one afternoon after a long meeting. "I shouldn't be dragging you into this." Arthur watched him carefully, recognizing the sincerity behind the self-criticism. "As long as you're doing the work, Tom, I'm not being dragged. I'm choosing to walk beside you." Tom nodded, though guilt still flickered behind his eyes. But it was during a follow-up meeting with one of Tom's legal advisors that Arthur noticed something surprising. When the advisor asked Tom a difficult question, one that would have triggered defensiveness in the past, Tom didn't deflect. He didn't blame. He answered honestly, admitting he had made the mistake and outlining how he planned to correct it. Arthur sat quietly, absorbing the moment. The humility, the accountability, it wasn't performative. It was real. Later, walking out of the building, Arthur studied his son with a new lens. Tom wasn't the arrogant why. Our man who believed the world owed him everything. He wasn't the resentful son who weaponized blame. He was someone scarred, chastened, reshaped by consequences and learning, really learning from them. For the first time, Arthur saw not a reflection of past pain, but the possibility of a different future. A future where Tom could stand on his own. A future where Arthur didn't have to choose between dignity and love. But the path ahead was still uncertain, still precarious. And Arthur sensed the next challenge was coming, one that would test both of them in ways neither could yet see. The letter arrived on a gray Thursday morning, slipped under Tom's apartment door like a quiet threat. When he picked it up and saw the government seal, his stomach collapsed. The legal trouble he thought he had handled, the same issues he had been slowly untangling, had escalated. There were discrepancies the auditors believed were intentional. There would be a court hearing. There could be fines, penalties, even a record. For a long time, Tom just sat on the edge of his couch, the paper trembling in his hands. He had expected consequences, yes, but not this. He felt the past tightening around him, every mistake echoing in the hollow of his chest. He wanted to break down. He wanted to run. But for once, he didn't. He knew exactly what he needed to do. He called Arthur. When Arthur picked up, he immediately heard the strain in Tom's voice. "Dad, something happened. I need to talk to you." They met at the cafe, a familiar crossroads in their uncertain journey. Tom explained everything: the court date, the charges, the mistakes that led to them. This time, he didn't sugarcoat his decisions or blame anyone else. He laid it all out plainly, openly, with a humility Arthur had never seen in him. Arthur listened, heart heavy, not just with worry, but with the old fear of being pulled back into the same destructive patterns. Supporting Tom now could unravel months of progress, but abandoning him could destroy the fragile trust they were rebuilding. "This is serious," Arthur said softly. "I know," Tom replied, voice thin, "and I'm not asking you to save me, just to be there, if you think I've earned that." Arthur studied him for a long moment. Tom wasn't manipulating him, not this time. He was terrified, ashamed, and painfully honest. "All right," Arthur finally said. "I'll support you, but only if you stay accountable. No excuses, no shortcuts." Tom nodded immediately. "I will." But not everyone agreed with Arthur's decision. Sophie confronted him later that same day. "Arthur, you can't keep doing this," she insisted. "Every time Tom stumbles, you rush in and he never learns." "He is learning," Arthur argued. "Or he's pretending long enough for you to feel sorry for him," she countered, frustration tightening her voice. "You have to protect yourself, too." Other relatives echoed her warnings. "It's too soon to trust him. He's just scared, not changed. You deserve peace, Arthur." He understood their concerns, but none of them had seen Tom's sincerity up close. None had watched him struggle to rebuild piece by piece. Still, their doubts lingered in Arthur's mind as the court date approached. The courtroom was cold and formal, smelling faintly of old paper and polished wood. Tom sat beside his attorney, shoulders squared but tense. Arthur sat behind him in the gallery, his presence quiet but unmistakably supportive. Clara had offered to come, but Arthur asked her not to. This was something he and Tom needed to face alone. As the hearing began, the prosecutor laid out the case: financial negligence, improper filings, discrepancies in accounts. None of it surprised Arthur. Tom had already confessed most of it to him, but hearing it spoken aloud, framed through a legal lens, made it feel heavier. Tom's attorney emphasized cooperation, the steps Tom had already taken to make amends, and his willingness to accept responsibility. But the judge wanted more than scripted statements. He wanted testimony. "Mr. Arthur Green," the bailiff called. Arthur stood, heart pounding, and walked to the stand. Tom didn't turn around, but Arthur felt his son's fear radiating behind him. After being sworn in, Arthur looked directly at the judge. He didn't glamorize Tom. He didn't hide the truth. "My son made serious mistakes," he said, steady but emotional. "For years, he acted with arrogance and anger. He pushed people away, including me." Tom lowered his head. "But," Arthur continued, voice tightening with conviction, "he has changed. And not because he was forced to. He changed because he finally faced the consequences, because he finally chose to grow up. He's taken responsibility in ways I never thought I'd see. He works harder than he ever has, and he's trying, truly trying, to repair the damage he caused." He paused, breath catching. "He's not the man he used to be, and I believe he deserves the chance to keep becoming better." Silence followed his words, thick, charged, meaningful. Tom finally looked at him then, gratitude shining through shame. The judge retreated to consider the arguments. Minutes dragged on, slow and suffocating. When he returned, the courtroom stilled. Tom would receive a mild sentence: mandatory financial restitution, required business counseling and a probation period. No jail time, no permanent scar that couldn't be healed. Relief washed through Tom so visibly he nearly slumped forward. Arthur's shoulders eased, but only slightly. The consequences were real but survivable, and the message was clear. Tom's past still mattered, but it didn't define his future. Outside the courtroom, Tom stood quietly beside Arthur. "Thank you," he said, "not for saving me, but for believing in me." Arthur felt a mix of emotions: relief, exhaustion, lingering fear, but also something gentler. "You earned it," Arthur replied. Tom nodded, understanding the weight of those words. As Arthur walked away later that afternoon, he felt drained. Helping Tom had cost him, emotionally, socially, mentally. But as he stepped out into the sharp Chicago air, he knew the hardest part wasn't behind them. The courtroom wasn't the final test. The real test was rebuilding their relationship, step by fragile step, in the aftermath of everything they had survived. The weeks after the court case unfolded with a strange, tentative softness. Arthur and Tom continued meeting, not with the urgency of crisis, but with the slow patience of two people learning to speak a language they had forgotten long ago. Their conversations still carried tension. Old habits didn't vanish overnight, but there was less defensiveness now, less sharpness. They listened more. They paused before reacting. They tried. Healing wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cinematic. It was small moments stitched together. A shared meal without raised voices, a quiet walk by the river, a text message sent not out of obligation but out of genuine thoughtfulness. Arthur found himself watching Tom for signs of the man he was becoming, trying to separate the past from the present. Tom, in turn, worked to show Arthur consistency, not grand gestures but effort. Still, the deeper wounds remained untouched, until Arthur decided to do something he had resisted his entire life. He reached out to a therapist. The first session felt awkward. Arthur wasn't used to talking about himself. He had spent decades holding emotions like tightly sealed containers. But when the therapist asked him why he had come, something inside him cracked open. "Because I don't want to keep repeating the same silences," Arthur murmured. "I want to understand why they became my only language." Therapy became a space where Arthur began to unravel what he had buried. The exhaustion of being the quiet backbone of his family, the shame of feeling unseen by his son, the guilt of enabling Tom's worst habits out of fear of losing him. It was painful, uncomfortable, but liberating. To Arthur's surprise, Tom also began attending therapy. He didn't announce it. Arthur found out accidentally during one of their lunches when Tom mentioned a session in passing, then flushed slightly when he realized what he had admitted. "You're in therapy?" Arthur asked gently. Tom nodded. "Yeah, I needed help figuring out why I kept hurting you, and myself." He looked down, fiddling with his napkin. "I want to do better, I just don't always know how." For Arthur, that admission was more powerful than any apology. Throughout all of this, Clara stayed by Arthur's side, not controlling, not intruding, just offering steady encouragement and emotional clarity. She had a way of showing him perspectives he couldn't see on his own. One evening, as they walked through the quiet dining room after closing, Arthur confessed, "It's hard letting myself be open with him. Vulnerability still feels like weakness." Clara shook her head gently. "Vulnerability is strength, Arthur. It's how relationships breathe. You don't have to carry everything alone anymore." She paused, giving him a small smile. "Let Tom meet you halfway." Her words stayed with him, echoing during therapy sessions, during moments when he stepped back from frustration instead of reacting, and during times when he allowed himself to admit he was okay. Family dynamics shifted too. Sophie, cautious by nature, watched the changes from a distance. She didn't trust easily, not Tom's transformation, and not Arthur's willingness to extend grace again. But even she began to notice something different. At a small family gathering, she observed Tom consciously stepping aside to help, offering genuine conversation instead of performance. She also watched Arthur relax in ways she hadn't seen in years, the tension in his shoulders replaced by a fragile but real peace. "You two seem better," Sophie said to Arthur quietly in the kitchen. Arthur gave a soft nod. "We're trying, that's all I can say." Sophie smiled faintly, not fully convinced but hopeful. Tom's growth became more evident as time passed. He no longer dodged responsibility or minimized his faults. He asked questions instead of assuming answers. He apologized without prompting. He caught himself before slipping into old patterns, and when he did slip, he owned it. One afternoon, Tom confessed, "I didn't realize how much anger I carried, or how much of it I directed at you because I couldn't face myself." Arthur felt the words settle deep inside him, not as a weapon, but as a balm. In therapy, Arthur continued confronting his own regrets. For years, he blamed himself for not being the father he thought Tom needed. But with time, he began to understand that he couldn't rewrite the past, and that forgiveness included forgiving himself. He realized he had done the best he could with the tools he had, and he realized Tom was learning to do the same. The shift between them, small, delicate, but profound, culminated during a quiet moment after dinner one evening. They sat on a park bench, watching the sun dissolve into the horizon. For a long time, neither spoke. The silence was no longer heavy, it was shared. Finally, Tom turned slightly. "Dad, thank you for not giving up on me, for helping me even when I didn't deserve it." Arthur felt his throat tight. He nodded slowly. "We're both learning, Tom, that's what matters." Tom's expression softened, humility settling where arrogance once lived. And though neither said it aloud, they both felt it. The weight between them had eased, just enough to believe that real healing was possible. But the journey wasn't finished. Not yet. The shift didn't come all at once. It unfolded quietly, like early morning light slipping through curtains. Arthur and Tom found themselves working together in small but meaningful ways, not out of obligation, but out of genuine cooperation. For the first time in their lives, they weren't standing on opposite ends of a battlefield. They were on the same side, navigating challenges with a mutual respect that felt new and unfamiliar, yet deeply welcome. Arthur noticed it during a routine meeting at the restaurant. Tom listened, truly listened, offering thoughtful questions instead of quick judgments. And when Arthur spoke, Tom didn't roll his eyes or bristle with defensiveness. He nodded, absorbing the insight. There was still tension, still moments where old habits tried to claw their way back, but both men paused before falling into familiar patterns. They were choosing differently now, choosing growth, choosing effort. For Arthur, it sparked something quietly powerful, confidence, not the brittle kind built on pride or validation, but the steady, grounding kind that came from finally accepting his own story. He wasn't trying to rewrite the past anymore. He wasn't trying to punish Tom or repay old pain. He simply existed more fully, more honestly, aware of the strength he had always carried but never claimed. He made decisions without fear. He spoke without shrinking. He stepped into roles with assurance rather than hesitation. And with every step, Arthur felt more in control, not by dominating anyone but by reclaiming himself. Tom, too, began rising in ways that surprised everyone, perhaps even himself. He started exploring a new career path, one rooted not in flashy promises or external approval, but in something that genuinely interested him. He shadowed professionals, asked questions, took notes, and admitted when he didn't know something. Gone was the young man chasing quick success or validation. In his place was someone trying to build a foundation brick by brick, even if it meant starting at the bottom. And for the first time, Tom didn't resist the slow pace of progress. He respected it. A small family gathering marked this new chapter. Sophie hosted it, a modest affair with simple food, familiar faces, and soft music humming in the background. There were awkward moments, yes, pauses heavy with memories no one quite knew how to address. But there was also laughter, conversation, glimpses of a family trying to stitch itself back together, not perfectly, but earnestly. Tom helped set the table. Arthur carved the roast. At one point, Sophie watched them interact. No tension, no bitterness, just a cautious ease, and her expression softened. She wasn't ready to declare everything healed, but she allowed herself hope. Everyone did. Later in the evening, Arthur stepped out onto the back porch, letting the cool air settle around him. The night sky stretched above, quiet and expansive. He leaned against the railing, reflecting on the long, winding path that had brought him here. He had learned much, hard lessons carved into him through years of silence, hurt, and slow forgiveness. He learned that resentment was a chain he had unknowingly carried for decades. He learned that love without boundaries wasn't love. It was sacrifice disguised as loyalty. He learned that forgiveness wasn't about approving someone's past, but freeing himself from its grip, and he learned that healing wasn't a destination. It was a journey made up of countless small choices. Tom joined him a moment later, standing beside him without speaking. They looked out at the same view, breathing in the same night air. There was no need for grand declarations. Tom cleared his throat softly. "I'm still figuring things out," he said, "but I'm glad we're doing this together." Arthur nodded. "So am I." It wasn't perfect, it wasn't finished, but it was real. As they returned inside, laughing softly at something Sophie said, clinking glasses with relatives who had once doubted this reconciliation, Arthur felt something he hadn't experienced in years: optimism. Not because everything had fallen into place, but because he had learned to embrace life's complexities. The beauty, the pain, the healing, all intertwined. A new legacy began forming that night. Not built on wealth or business ventures, not on reputation or status, but on the relationships Arthur was mending and the emotional courage he was passing down. The legacy of a man who finally learned how to stand tall and love deeply at the same time. And though the journey wasn't over, Arthur felt ready for whatever came next. The late afternoon sun spilled across the quiet Chicago park as Arthur and Tom walked side by side, their footsteps slow and unhurried. For years, walking together had felt impossible, each step weighed down by resentment, anger, or silence. But today, there was no tension threading between them. What filled the space instead was something calmer, steadier, mutual respect. A sense that after all the storms, they had finally found their way back to one another. They didn't speak at first. They didn't need to. The simple act of walking together, shoulder to shoulder, felt like a quiet victory neither man took for granted. Eventually, Arthur motioned toward a weathered wooden bench beneath a large oak tree, the kind of spot where people had sat for decades, sharing life's hardest truths and softest moments. "Let's sit," Arthur said. Tom nodded, lowering himself beside his father. The breeze rustled the leaves overhead, carrying with it the faint sounds of children playing in the distance. It felt peaceful, uncomplicated, something neither of them had ever experienced together. For a moment, they simply breathed. Then Arthur spoke. "You know," he began slowly, "I spent years thinking the distance between us was all your doing. Your anger, your choices, your words." He paused, gathering the courage he'd only recently learned to access. "But I had a part in it too, Tom. I stayed silent when I should have spoken. I avoided conflict when I should have been honest. I thought being quiet meant being strong, but all it did was build walls between us." Tom swallowed hard, his jaw tightening. "Dad, you were always the one holding everything together. I blamed you because it was easier than looking at myself. I pushed you away because I didn't want you to see how lost I was." He looked at Arthur, eyes softened with sincerity. "But you never gave up on me. You came back every time, and I don't know how to repay that." Arthur shook his head gently. "You don't repay love, Tom, you honor it, and you've been doing that." Tom blinked, the words hitting deeper than he expected. After a long breath, Arthur leaned back on the bench. "There's something I've learned, something I wish I'd understood earlier. Strength isn't about never breaking, and it isn't about being the loudest or the toughest. Real strength," He touched his chest lightly. Real strength is vulnerability. It's admitting when you're wrong, forgiving when you could hold a grudge, choosing to try again even after life knocks you down. This time Tom didn't just hear the words, he absorbed them. The man he used to be would have dismissed such advice, too prideful or too angry to listen. But now he nodded slowly, deeply. "I think I finally understand that," he said, "and I want to live by it." Silence settled between them, but it wasn't empty. It was full of healing, of understanding, of a bond reforged through fire. They both tilted their heads toward the sky, watching the branches shift above them. There was no need for more words. They had arrived at a place neither thought possible, quiet understanding. They both knew their relationship would never be perfect. They had too much history, too many scars, but perfection was never the goal. What mattered was realness, effort, forward movement. And they had that now. Later, they returned home for a simple family dinner. Nothing extravagant, nothing performative. Sophie greeted them with a cautious smile, searching their faces for signs of strain. But instead, she found something she hadn't seen in years: peace. A soft, unspoken peace that settled over the table like a warm blanket. Conversations flowed gently. Laughter came naturally. And when Tom spoke about the new career path he was exploring, there was no bravado in his tone, just genuine excitement, grounded ambition. For the first time, Arthur believed in Tom's future without reservation. And for the first time, Tom believed in himself. As the evening drew to a close and they walked toward the door together, Arthur felt a calm certainty settle in his chest, a sense that the legacy he would leave behind was no longer rooted in sacrifice, or silence, or regret, but in healing, in forgiveness, in love redefined. And as they stepped out into the night, father and son side by side, the final truth of their journey became unmistakably clear. Arthur and Tom walked into the future together, their bond stronger than ever, their hearts healed by the power of forgiveness, and the quiet promise that, no matter what, they would face the world side by side.